headlines on this Friday afternoon, September 16th. Top China's legislature Li Zhanshu meets with South Korean National Assembly Speaker Kim Jin-pyo on this Thursday to address productive cooperation between the two legislatures and beyond. Over in the US, South Korea's vice ministers of foreign affairs and defense addressed a host of bilateral issues with relevant US authorities, ranging from North Korea to economic matters. The Jeongseon Arirang festival is back in Gangwon province until this Sunday for the first time since the start of the pandemic, much to the delight of both the performers and spectators. We begin at the National Assembly here in Seoul, where Speaker Kim Jin-pyo is currently hosting top Chinese legislator Li Zhanshu, who arrived here in the country late Thursday. Now, for more on this, I have our political correspondent Lee Kyung-eun standing by live at the Parliament. Kyung-eun, let's begin with a few words on the issues being addressed by the two legislators.
Hi, Sunny. The meeting is set for 2 p.m., but now before getting into the session, the two speakers just took a photograph to mark the occasion. The meeting will last for about an hour, and it'll be followed by a joint press briefing at 3 p.m. Now, the meeting marks the 30th anniversary of Seoul and Beijing's diplomatic ties, and it is likely to be focused on boosting bilateral cooperation with global supply chain and North Korea's denuclearization almost certainly topping the agenda. Some sensitive issues like Seoul's push to normalize the operation of the U.S. anti-missile defense system THAAD could also be discussed too. Following the meeting, Lee will move on to hold talks with President Yoon Suk-yeol. Then there will be a banquet in the evening at the National Assembly Speaker's official residence. Prior to coming here, Lee visited South Korea's tech conglomerate, LG's major R&D facility in Seoul, where much of his focus is set to be on the LG's EV battery, which ranks number 2 in the global sales.
Right. Meanwhile, Kyung-eun, what can you share with us about the broader implications of this trip to Seoul by Li Zhanshu, which of course comes at the invitation of Kim Jin-pyo?
Well, I think I have to touch upon the fact that Li Zhanshu is actually third highest official in China, and he's very close to President Xi Jinping, along with his right-hand man, Vice President Wang Qishan, who actually came to South Korea for attending President Yoon's inauguration in May. And we also have to note that South Korea is one of the first countries he has visited after 3 years without overseas travel due to COVID-19. And observers see this as China's attempt to boost economic ties with Seoul, as the U.S. is currently trying to dominate global supply chains along with its allies, including Seoul. Lee's visit to LG Science Park supports that idea, as that's the very place U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen visited during her visit to Seoul. All this also comes as President Xi is looking for an unprecedented third term in office in October. Now, eyes are on whether Lee's visit could pave the way for a summit between President Xi and President Yoon Suk-yeol. Back to you, Sunny.
All right, Kyung-eun, thank you for that coverage. Moving on then, in Washington, D.C., South Korea's delegation of diplomatic and defense officials are meeting with relevant members of the Biden administration to coordinate their bilateral security framework and to convey concerns regarding the fate of electric vehicles made outside of North America. Foreign Affairs correspondent Min Suk-hyun reports.
South Korea's first Vice Foreign Minister Cho Yeon-dong and Vice Defense Minister Shin Bum-chul met with the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in Washington on Thursday. The two vice ministers expressed their gratitude for the National Security Council's interest and support in resuming the high-level meeting of the Extended Deterrence Strategy and Consultation Group. While discussing the security situation on the Korean peninsula, the vice ministers stressed that it's more important than ever to strengthen the extended deterrence against North Korea and continue their related cooperation. Sullivan reaffirmed the U.S. government's commitment to counter North's evolving nuclear and missile threats and hoped for effective talks at the vice ministerial level meeting of the EDSCG slated for this Friday. It will be the first such session in nearly 5 years. At the meeting with Sullivan, the two vice ministers also delivered South Korea's concerns over the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which excludes Korean-made electric vehicles from receiving tax credits. Seoul's first Vice Foreign Minister Cho Yeon-dong said they requested a review of the issue and urged for possible measures to minimize the impact of the new U.S. law on Korean automakers. On Thursday, Cho also met with U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman in an effort to resolve the IRA issue as well as to bolster bilateral cooperation in various fields, including semiconductors and supply chains. Meanwhile, Seoul's Vice Defense Minister Shin Bum-chul held talks with his U.S. counterpart, Kathleen Hicks. While sharing their assessments on North Korea, the two agreed to maintain a strong joint defense posture and to closely work to achieve North's denuclearization. They also agreed to strengthen the extended deterrence against Pyongyang amid growing North Korean nuclear and missile threats. Jeongseon Arirang News.
And over in New York next week on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, President Yoon Suk-yeol will hold bilateral talks with his US counterpart Joe Biden, as well as his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida. Our presidential office correspondent Yoon Jung-min has more on the agenda ahead.
President Yoon Suk-yeol will meet separately with his U.S. and Japanese counterparts, President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, next week in New York on the sidelines of the 77th United Nations General Assembly.
We have agreed to hold bilateral summits with the United States and Japan. We are currently in the process of finalizing the times.
The Yoon-Kishida meeting will mark the first summit between the two countries in 2 years and 9 months. Although the agenda has not been set, Seoul's presidential office said both sides have gladly agreed to meet. This bilateral will be watched closely by many as the neighbors have been locked in an extensive row over disputes stemming from Japan's 1910 to 1945 colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula. As for the Yoon-Biden talks, the two leaders could discuss in detail about follow-ups to their May summit, sitting down one-on-one again in just 4 months' time. President Yoon's first UN address will focus on expanding South Korea's role on the global stage by proposing to tackle together the pandemic, climate change, supply chain disruptions, as well as digital and cultural divides. He'll also hammer home the importance of global solidarity in deterring war and nuclear threats.
The Yoon Suk-yeol administration's 5-year diplomatic vision demonstrates that we continue to expand freedom, maintain a consistent and predictable foreign policy line by working with the international community, and foster peace and prosperity together with like-minded global partners.
After addressing the 193-member assembly, Yoon will also meet with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for talks on North Korea. A busy week awaits the South Korean president as he embarks on a 7-day, 5-night, 3-nation tour this Sunday, which will first take him to London to attend the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, as well as Canada, for a summit with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Back on Thursday, the leaders of China and Russia sat down on the sidelines of a regional summit in Uzbekistan to address issues of mutual interest, including the situation in Ukraine, to which Mr. Xi Jinping reportedly shared questions and concerns. Now, this is according to Vladimir Putin himself. Our Kim Hyo-sun reports.
The long-anticipated summit between the leaders of China and Russia took place in Uzbekistan on Thursday on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. The meeting began with Russian President Vladimir Putin's opening statement, during which he told his Chinese counterpart that he understands his questions and concerns about the ongoing Ukraine war. He also hailed the close ties between the two countries.
The foreign policy tandem between Moscow and Beijing plays a key role in ensuring global and regional stability. We jointly advocate the formation of a just, democratic and multipolar world order based on international law and the central role of the UN.
He also thanked Beijing for having a balanced position in connection with the Ukraine crisis before moving on to condemn the, quote, Western provocation in the Taiwan Strait. Calling Putin his old friend, Chinese President Xi Jinping stressed the role of the two countries in bringing stability to the global order.
China and Russia have maintained effective strategic communication. In the face of changes in the world, times and history, China is willing to work with Russia to demonstrate the responsibility of a major country, play a leading role, and inject stability into a turbulent world.
The last time the two met in person was in February when both leaders promised that the relationship between Russia and China would be, quote, without limits. The White House expressed concerns over the latest meeting between the leaders of Russia and China in a briefing Thursday. During an interview with CNN, White House spokesman John Kirby stressed that the whole world, including China, should align against what Putin is doing. He added that this is not the time for any kind of business as usual with the Russian leader. Jeongseon Arirang News.
And in Ukraine, Russian forces are reportedly shifting into a defensive strategy following the recent losses in the northeastern part of the country. Our Lee has the latest.
According to the governor of Luhansk, Sergei Gadai, Russian forces are fortifying their defenses, making it difficult for Ukrainian troops to maintain the pace of their advance. So far, Kyiv has recaptured more than 8,000 square kilometers in the northeast region of Kharkiv in its recent offensive, leading to a Russian withdrawal that left dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles abandoned. Now, with Russian forces ramping up defenses in the region to prevent further losses, Ukraine faces a tough battle to completely regain the region currently being recognized by Russia as an independent state. Meanwhile, EU Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen, speaking at a joint news conference with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky on Thursday, vowed to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. She says that while the EU will never be able to compensate the Ukrainian people for their sacrifices and fight for democracy, for humanity, for the respect of international rule of law, the EU will do its best to continue its support for the country during the war. She also pledged further assistance to the tune of $100 million to rebuild schools in Ukraine. Elsewhere, IAEA's Board of Governors backed a resolution on Thursday that deplores Russia's invasion of Ukraine and called for Ukraine to regain control of its nuclear facilities. The resolution calls for Moscow to immediately cease all actions against all nuclear facilities in Ukraine in order for the Ukrainian authorities to have full control. The resolution was voted against by both Russia and China, saying it was based on politically motivated lies and mistakes. Lee Arirang News.
Right, and on that note, we end part one of the Daily Report. In part two, we address President Yoon Suk-yeol's upcoming address at the UN in New York next week. Stay with us.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean new day. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
Welcome back. The 77th session of the UN General Assembly kicked off this past Tuesday at the UN headquarters in New York for a two-week run. Now, next week, that is on September 20th, day one of the high-level general debate, President Yoon Suk-yeol is poised to deliver a keynote speech. For more, I have Professor Chung Gu-yeon at Kangwon National University joining the session virtually. Professor Chung, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I also have Dr. Patrick Cronin at Hudson Institute live on the line. Dr. Cronin, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Right. Professor Chung, according to the top office here, the president will share South Korea's role as a global leader committed to international concerns during his keynote speech. That being said, what are some global issues that you believe South Korea can actively work to commit to?
Well, I think it will reflect the current international landscape like coronavirus, pandemic, energy security, and climate change. Of course, Ukraine crisis. All of these issues do not exist separately at the same time. It is entangled with great power politics. So South Korea is not immune from those threats. So that's why United Nations mentions that this year is a kind of watershed and international order is at the crossroads. So in that sense, so President Yoon probably emphasized the value of solidarity between democracies and they underlined how South Korea can contribute to sustain the rules-based order and universal value, especially in terms of development assistance to support victims from pandemic, food security, and recovery of Ukraine. Of course, helping building and supply chains and infrastructure across the Indo-Pacific might appear in its agenda during the UN Assembly.
Right, indeed. And Dr. Cronin, how do you respond to the Yoon administration's hopes to perhaps expand South Korea's participation in global affairs? I mean, what are your prospects with regard to these intentions?
Well, I think the prospects are excellent because the demand is there. The world needs more peace. It needs more responses to global challenges like climate change and COVID. It needs the protection against nuclear proliferation and war. The political will is there from South Korea, from President Yoon. He's showing that South Korea is one of the top countries in the world. There are 193 members of the United Nations, and South Korea is in the top 5%. So if it's not South Korea leading to help promote answers and solutions and to mobilize the world community together to find common solutions and strengthen multilateralism, who is it going to be? So it's very important for South Korea to do this. Implementation will be key, and the trick, I think, for the Yoon administration will be to find issues that resonate with the South Korean electorate and population that are also very much in need of responses globally.
Right. And keeping Dr. Cronin's kind words in mind, Professor Chung, speaking within your capacity, of course, as a scholar, do you believe that South Korea can now perhaps afford to look beyond its national borders and interests to promote those of the international community?
Well, President Yoon made it clear from his inauguration that South Korea is willing to serve as a global pivotal state with a strategic clarity. That's a kind of big difference from the previous administrations. And I think it reflects the Yoon administration's understanding that South Korea developed into a democratic country with successful economic development under this rules-based liberal order. So in that sense, Yoon administration will take a more assertive role, but its diplomatic resource and priority might be diverted to the current issues in Korean Peninsula, especially North Korea issue. As you all know, that North Korea has conducted missile tests multiple times from the beginning of this year and changed the nature of negotiation with the United States from denuclearization to arms control. So that become a major challenger that makes South Korea more formidable to achieve its global agenda and global role.
Right. And Dr. Cronin, President Yoon is also expected to reiterate calls for North Korea to abandon its nuclear ambitions at the UN platform. That being said, what first are your thoughts with regard to President Yoon's audacious plan for North Korea?
Well, it's important to stand up for nuclear nonproliferation and to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. So he's doing the right thing, even though it has very slim chance of succeeding, given the fact that Kim Jong-un has just enshrined in law not just permanent nuclear weapons status for North Korea, but the actual preemptive use of nuclear weapons if North Korean regime feels threatened. That's a threat to Northeast Asia, to international security. So audacious plan may not work, but it is very important for the Yoon administration to stand up for the right thing, for this rules-based system for nuclear nonproliferation.
Right, and Professor Chung, as Dr. Cronin has mentioned earlier this month, North Korea virtually, well, it's set in stone, perhaps, its nuclear status by putting in force a law that allows for preemptive nuclear strikes. And Kim Jong-un himself vowed that he would never give up his nuclear weapons. What perhaps are the broader implications of this latest display of defiance, if I may?
Well, I think the recent codifications of nuclear first use doctrine is not that surprising. And given that North Korea is not a country of rule of law, it is not necessary as well. But what North Korea is saying is that it is a nuclear state and it should be recognized as a nuclear state and will not rest from the negotiation for denuclearization in the near term. And during the Spring People's Assembly meeting last year, Kim Jong-un made it clear that it is not an object of negotiation as well, especially the economic compensation as addressed by audacious initiative under the Yoon administration. So I think South Korea's audacious initiative, as Patrick mentions, is in kind of confronting major challenges from the North Korea and necessitate to rebalance the components of its audacious initiative. So in that sense, it is meaningful that we are kind of working on extended deterrence measure with the United States and tightly coordinate trilateral coordination with Japan as well. So the South Korea is expecting the summit between Japan and with Japan in the New York. So I think we're gonna kind of send a clear signal to North Korea that South Korea is not challenged by its recent codification.
Right. And Dr. Cronin, do you suppose this latest announcement by Kim Jong-un is perhaps an attempt to redirect attention back to North Korea and perhaps leverage his negotiating power?
Well, Kim Jong-un has a knack for gaining attention, and certainly he wants all the leverage he can get, but I think it's more than that. I think Kim Jong-un has his own audacious plan, and it's a strategy to solidify his legitimacy and his strength and power at home, but also his influence abroad. And right now, I think he feels emboldened by essentially the full backing of Beijing and Moscow, and he's flaunting this in international rhetoric to basically say to Seoul and Tokyo and Washington and others, what are you going to do about it? Because I am going to move ahead with my nuclear status, and you're going to have to deal with me on that basis in the future. So I'm going to dictate the terms of diplomacy. You're not going to determine them.
Right. Professor Chung, I ask this as a layman, of course, as a layperson. If nuclear disarmament is not likely, would it not be more practical, perhaps, to focus on nuclear arms control and perhaps make sure or discourage North Korea from making new nuclear weapons and perhaps allowing it to keep the ones it already owns?
Well, as a temporary measure, of course, arms control or reduction of nuclear arsenal might be understandable, but that does not make South Korea safer. And also strategic stability in the Northeast Asia will be in peril and violating the non-proliferation norms. And as Patrick mentions, and now behind North Korea, there is China and Russia, even though it is a tactical alignment, which will embolden North Korea's kind of assertiveness in the regions. And of course, it is not about South Korea, but also regional countries and regional partners such as Japan will make it more seriously about this issue as well. So as a temporary measure, of course, it can be accepted, but in the long term, denuclearization is necessary.
Dr. Cronin, simply speaking then, what would be the broader implications of acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear power state, which of course the US has ruled out?
Well, there are two basic problems with that. The first is that Kim Jong-un might misperceive it as weakness. And if he sees weakness, who knows what he'll ask for next or what he'll do next. The second problem is that it could puncture the solidarity of the U.S.-South Korean alliance. It is the Yoon administration that from day one requested from Washington a resumption of extended deterrence talks. Those talks are just now underway. So it's very important for the United States to fully support and embrace our South Korean ally as it tries to deal with this issue over the long term. So there are problems with this. If North Korea really wants negotiations, it can sit down at the table anytime with South Korea and the United States. It simply has to acknowledge that it's not going to permanently hold on to nuclear weapons because that contravenes not only past commitments and international legal requirements, but also peace and security in the region.
Professor Chung, President Yoon Suk-yeol has been in office for a little over 4 months now, and on the international stage has been actively seeking for support for regional peace and stability amid Pyongyang's provocations, of course. How do you assess his efforts, perhaps, and their significance?
Well, I think current Yoon administration has confronted one of the formidable international landscape if compared to his predecessors. War in Ukraine, Chinese assertiveness is getting stronger, and North Korea's nuclear ambitions. And all three of these countries are aligned together, which make a kind of blockization in the region as well. So this international landscape make it very difficult for South Korea to pursue its global agenda, not to mention of North Korea's denuclearizations. But the dilemma is that South Korea cannot be just remained within the Korean peninsula. South Korea itself is at the crossroad to become a global pivotal power or kind of more meaningful middle power in the region. So in that sense, Yoon administration is kind of rebalancing and try to figure out how these challenges can be navigated with cooperation with allies and partners. So in that sense, we can understand South Korea's endeavor to be more multilateralized and to be partners of regional countries and solid kind of consolidated cooperation with the United States.
Right. And in the meantime, Dr. Cronin, North Korea, it's been an active advocate of Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. Pundits say this stance perhaps reflects its hopes for continued Russian veto power at the UN Security Council against additional sanctions in the event of another nuclear test. What are your thoughts on this view?
Well, when you're a country facing so many sanctions from the UN Security Council, you certainly want as many votes there as you can get. And so certainly supporting Russia's war in Ukraine is one way to win Moscow's favor. But as Professor Chung's talking about, I think correctly, North Korea sort of recalibrating its sort of regional relations, or rather South Korea recalibrating its relations globally. I think North Korea has its own plan again here to use this revisionist alignment with China, with Russia, and perhaps with Iran and others to push back on the United States and South Korea and Japan and others. And it sees an opportunity here. So it's not just about the votes. It's about thinking there's momentum, or at least wanting to show that there's momentum behind this. And so just as President Yoon could go to Madrid and the NATO summit and embrace the NATO strategic concept, you know, Kim Jong-un now can maybe talk about sending arms to the war in Ukraine. It's very bad timing, of course, because Russia's just had serious setbacks in the war in Ukraine, rather embarrassing for a so-called major power against Ukraine.
Right, and against that backdrop, Professor Chung, China's Xi Jinping, quite contrary to expectations, if I may, has expressed questions and concerns with regard to the situation in Ukraine during bilateral talks with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, as my colleague Kim Hyo-sun mentioned earlier. How do you interpret Beijing's or President Xi Jinping's latest stance with regard to the situation in Ukraine?
Well, China, of course, tactically aligned with Russia as well in terms of Ukraine crisis. It does not really support, but at the same time, China mentions that it supported rules-based orders and does not really support it or send the kind of material support to the Russian so far. So in that sense, China is kind of hedging or balancing the situations and try kind of minimize the kind of risk out of this Ukraine crisis. So that is the kind of stance that it's not kind of fully confront United States, but at the same time, it is kind of balancing the kind of relationship between Russia and the United States.
Right, and staying with Russia and China, Dr. Cronin, in response to Xi Jinping's stance with regard to Ukraine, Vladimir Putin said that he, actually thanked the Chinese leader for his balanced view with regard to the war in Ukraine. Do you see this attitude perhaps as affecting or influencing his future direction, perhaps, with regard to the war in Ukraine? Or is that wishful thinking on my part?
Well, there's bound to be some influence, but I think it's mostly wishful thinking because Putin is all in on aggression. He can't really take it back. The most he can do is stop going forward, and the Ukrainian military is already helping him do that. So he's in a very embarrassing situation. He's lost face. Remember, February 24th, he was able to go into Ukraine knowing that he had this no limits backing by China. Now, it turns out there are limits to China. They don't want to lose, and Russia's right now losing.
Right. All right, Dr. Cronin, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Chung, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
August was a lucrative month for South Korean car makers as the value of their exports marked a 36% on-year expansion to hit over $4 billion. Our Finance Ministry correspondent Ji-young has more on these findings.
Despite concerns of sluggish demand amid a slowing global economy, South Korean car makers posted an all-time high export value for the month of August. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy said on Friday that outbound shipments of cars last month stood at over $4.1 billion. This is up roughly 36% compared to the same month a year earlier. The number of cars exported also jumped nearly 30% from the same period the previous year, standing at around 168,000 vehicles. The ministry said this is the biggest on-year increase recorded this year for a single month, mainly thanks to a big rise in eco-friendly vehicle exports, which account for about a quarter of South Korea's overall number of auto exports. More than 40,000 environmentally friendly cars were exported last month, up 47% compared to the same period last year. The dollar value of these eco-friendly auto exports also soared by roughly 46%. The ministry attributed the rise to the popularity of hybrid cars, with their exports up by around 63% and electric cars increasing by 32% on-year. Hybrid and electric car models that led the rise in exports include Renault Korea Motors XM3, Hyundai's electric car, the Ioniq 5, and Kia's Niro. In the U.S., South Korea's main car export market, Korean automakers increased their market share by 0.7 percentage points compared to a year earlier, standing at 10.7% in August, led by electric cars. Ji-young, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Samsung Electronics has shared its commitment to carbon neutrality by the year 2050. Our Shin Ha-young has more on the company's ambitious green print, if I may.
South Korean tech giant Samsung Electronics' new keyword for its business strategy is eco-friendly. Samsung announced its new strategy on Thursday, saying that it will strive to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. It has also joined the RE100, a global initiative committing to work towards 100% renewable energy. Samsung aims to achieve this with its overseas businesses within 5 years. The company is working towards these goals to address the climate crisis.
Samsung Electronics is planning to do its best to tackle the climate crisis and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 through its innovative technologies like ultra-low power products and resource circularity.
The company is also developing products that requires less electricity with the goal of lowering power consumption levels by 30% in 2030 compared to products from 2019. As part of resource circularity, it is planning to expand its electronic waste collection system from 50 countries to 180 countries by 2030. For used smartphones, they will be collected and parts reused for other devices. In terms of water resource efficiency, the company said it will maintain water consumption for global chip lines to 2021 levels by 2030 by improving water treatment facilities and water restoration projects. It is also expected to develop carbon capture and utilization technologies. This will allow the company to store carbon emissions from semiconductor industrial sites and turn it into a usable resource. The same day, Samsung added that it wants its products to contribute to reducing carbon emissions. 신하영, 아리랑 뉴스.
An annual forum on peace over in Jeju Island provided participants with a fresh platform to share their thoughts on the importance of and ways to improve Seoul-Tokyo ties. Again, covered by our correspondents at the Foreign Ministry, here's Kim Dami.
Time for the so-called plus diplomacy to unlace the much tangled South Korea-Japan relations. At the 17th annual Jeju Forum on Thursday, experts from both Seoul and Tokyo agreed that the two countries need to find ways to cooperate and prosper together, especially when the current strategic environment is providing enough room for bilateral cooperation. They also agreed that the Yoon administration's reaching out to Japan meets South Korea's national dignity, such as its launch of the Joint Consultative Body to resolve dispute over Japan's wartime forced labor. But according to one of the participants of the South Korean task force, Tokyo also needs to come forward.
The Japanese side needs to understand that the historical dispute is not only South Korea's, but an issue that Japan also needs to cooperate on.
Ironing out the prolonged conflict has become much more complex, with a growing awareness of the issue among people in Japan. This is why experts stress leaders of the two countries need to convince their people of the complexity of the historical dispute and step up their efforts to move forward. One hopeful way is the summit between the leaders of South Korea and Japan next week.
The summit will naturally lead to an improvement of bilateral ties. Kishida's actual comments on what Japan has done to improve the relations will also help improve things.
In the meantime, active cultural, human-to-human exchanges are a must, especially among the younger generations who can look at history more objectively and enjoy and appreciate each other's cultures. A number of experts said now could be the right time for Japan to engage as the Yoon administration pursues a broader foreign policy under the vision of South Korea as a global pivotal state, an approach that aligns with Japan's strategy of free and open Indo-Pacific. Kim Dami, Arirang News, Jeju.
In Gangwon-do Province, a festival that seeks to share the sounds of the Korean traditional song Jeongseon Arirang is well underway for the first time amid the pandemic. Our Kim Jong-sil takes us there.
Jeongseon Arirang Festival doesn't start until a memorial service for 7 scholars has taken place. The scholars from the Korea dynasty are known to be the writers of a poem that later became the lyrics of the Korean folk song Arirang. For the very first time this year, though, some 70 descendants of the scholars joined the memorial to commemorate their ancestors. Arirang, inscribed on the UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage, is thought to be their way of expressing love and sorrow. Local residents and visitors from the neighboring cities all welcomed the festival's return.
I love it. I hope older people who went through tough times during the pandemic will come and enjoy the festival.
I am from Jeongseon myself, so I carry a sense of pride about Jeongseon Arirang. I hope more people will take interest and recognize the song in the future.
The 47th edition of the festival celebrated its opening night with many exciting performances.
As you can see behind me, thousands have gathered on this opening night to enjoy the various renditions of Jeongseon Arirang after a 2-year hiatus due to the pandemic.
The highlight of the opening ceremony, Kim Nam-gi's masterful performance of the tune. He's the oldest man alive to have sung the original version of Jeongseon Arirang and also performed at the opening of the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics.
Younger people should come so that Arirang can be passed on to the next generation. If the few remaining singers of this song quit, the whole culture may disappear. There are many young people here. I hope that they will sing along Arirang and continue the tradition in the future.
Other masters of Jeongseon Arirang will perform throughout the festival, which runs until Sunday. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News, Jeongseon.
Also on the cultural front, a growing number of theatrical productions are seeking to ensure that physical disabilities do little to keep their audience members from fully enjoying their shows. Our culture correspondent Kim Hyun-sung tells us and shows us how.
First, just listen. Now, just see. What you just heard and saw was a scene from Together as One, a Korean musical that's barrier-free. This piece attempts to bring down the bar so that everyone can enjoy it, even the visually and aurally impaired. The director actively sought out consultation from experts to bring out the best of this experience for all.
From the planning stages, we studied a lot about how the blind can understand this piece with just sounds. Also, for people with hearing impairments, they translated our show themselves, and we also got constant feedback on what can be added or fixed.
The story from start to finish has a narrator that vividly depicts the scene and storyline. There's also a touch tour, where the visually impaired can go up on stage before the show to touch and feel the props and the stage. On both ends of the stage, there are also screens of subtitles. The highlight of the show also rests on shadow interpreting, where sign language interpreters follow the actors to not only translate, but also to act out their emotions.
Other barrier-free acts that I've been part of, I just had to follow behind the actor or stand still, interpret their lines. But this is my first time following the actors and acting with them.
The parts that the actor couldn't deliver could be reborn with a whole new perspective and understanding with the sign interpreters acting.
It's not just the barrier-free aspect of the show that will resonate with the audience. It's also the message. The story is about twin brothers whose father has dwarfism. The brothers struggle with a lifelong complex of being short, so they set out on a quest to become taller, only to return with a more important lesson.
I think the message that the father tries to give to his sons can really resonate with the audience. And seeing an actor who has dwarfism playing the part of someone who has dwarfism, the message may strike closer to home.
There's a band and plenty of choreography with the basketball scenes, and the flow is really exciting, so there's plenty to enjoy.
The director says that while this piece hasn't brought down the barriers completely, through constant trial and error, many people are working on making the show better bit by bit.
음악, 극, 합체를 구경하는 관객 여러분, 우리 꼭 극장에서 만나요.
김현승, 아리랑 뉴스.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. The United Nations has paid tribute to Queen Elizabeth II. Following the passing of the UK's longest reigning monarch, the 193-member body observed a minute of silence to pay their respects. It was followed by a speech given by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who had this to say about the Queen.
The sun has set on a most extraordinary reign. We are here today to pay tribute to the memory of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Britain's longest reigning monarch. Queen Elizabeth was a pillar without peer on the world stage for more than 70 years.
The Queen died at the age of 96 on September 9th at her Scottish royal estate at Balmoral Castle. Her body is currently lying in state in London's Westminster Hall until the morning of September 19th. The funeral is set for the same day at Westminster Abbey. In a row over immigration, the U.S. state of Texas has sent 2 buses of undocumented migrants to the residence of U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris in Washington, D.C. The buses arrived at the VP's residence on Thursday local time, surprising volunteers who were expecting the migrants at UN Station, 6 kilometers away. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, refuting a claim by Harris that the U.S. border is secure, said the buses were intentionally sent to Harris's backyard. This comes just a day after Florida sent 50 migrants by plane to the resort island of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. The developments are part of escalatory moves from Republican states to ship migrants to so-called sanctuary states, which protect undocumented immigrants from deportation or prosecution. The world's second-largest cryptocurrency, Ethereum, has just completed an upgrade with its long-anticipated merge taking effect on Thursday. The upgrade will see the coin reduce its carbon emissions by over 99%. This because it no longer requires an energy-intensive proof-of-work mining process, instead using a proof-of-stake system, which allows users to stake their own tokens to validate transactions. Now, before the upgrade, the energy used to mine Ethereum matched Austria's electricity consumption at 72 terawatt-hours per year. And in our final story, tennis legend Roger Federer has announced his retirement after a remarkable 24-year-long career. The 41-year-old tennis player posted on social media on Thursday that he will retire from competitive tennis after next week's Lever Cup in London. Federer is widely regarded as one of the world's best players, with 20 Grand Slams to his name. He holds the world record for 237 consecutive weeks as world number 1. His announcement comes after struggling for 2 years with a knee injury. Federer mentioned that he still plans to play tennis in the future, but not at major tournaments. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Friday afternoon. Skies look dull and gray, and you can feel the warm moisture in the air, driven by the typhoon and an easterly wind. And we have nationwide rain in store. Parts of Gyeonggi-do province will have to brace for up to 60 millimeters, and other regions will see 5 to 40 millimeters, while some inland regions are expected to have blustery showers. And high temperatures combined with high humidity have led to a heat advisory in portions of Gyeonggi-do, Chungcheongnam-do, and Jeollado provinces. And that is very rare phenomenon in mid-September, happening for the first time in 11 years. So it might feel even hotter with feels like temperatures around 33 degrees. And Typhoon Nanmadol is moving northward. It's highly possible that it will arrive in Kyushu, Japan by next Monday. So those of you near Jeju Island and the south coast will have to be well prepared for strong winds and stormy conditions. And late season high temperatures will be prevalent this weekend, but the heat will be short-lived, moderating by next Tuesday. Have a wonderful weekend, and let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
That brings us to the end of this week's editions. Starting next Monday, we bring you a shorter version of the Daily Report to be followed by a new panel discussion program. Be sure to join us then. Thank you for now.
귀여운